talking now about a Tynwald presentation which has just gone on to all members, which you organised. What was the subject of that?
Well, I aim to change the Manx law to an opt-out system to follow the UK. We've been looking at this for a number of years, well, since I got in, and I believe it was put forward some years previously, but since I got in, I'm very keen to increase the number of organ donors that we have on the Isle of Man and take things forward in that direction.
Well, the head of the UK Blood Transfusion and Organ Transplant Service, Claire Willamant, is on the island. And Claire, you've just given that presentation to Tynwald members on opt-out organ donation. It's great that you could be here this afternoon. Thank you so much. Now, plans to change the rules on organ donation passed the final stage in the UK's Parliament at the end of last month, as far as I understand. So what is the situation now?
So the legislation is actually going ahead in several different parts of the UK in different ways. So England passed its legislation just at the end of last month, as you said. So they're just waiting for the Queen to sign a bit of paper, and then it's law in England. Scotland slightly behind, so that their legislation is still going through, but just about all parts of the UK are now moving towards an opt-out basis for organ donation.
Because Wales went for this in 2015. I mean, how have they been going with this? Has it improved figures over there?
Yeah, they've made real significant improvements across many things. Most importantly, the consent rates have increased, and they're now topping the league tables in the UK for organ donation, which is amazing considering that back in 2015 that they certainly weren't right at the top. And it's also delivered benefits in terms of the culture of the nation. There's an excitement, and you just know that Wales supports organ donation as a nation.
And in terms of dealing with what it must be an incredibly difficult subject for medical professionals who have to talk to families in this situation, what sort of difference do you think opting out rather than in makes in that sort of situation?
Well, it's actually really re-enthused our workforce. It shows that not just the general public, and we know that 80-90% of the general public support organ donation and would be happy to donate, but it also shows that the government supports it, that the medical teams support it. It's really created a sense of enthusiasm and support across all of the different medical teams involved.
I know when you've been interviewed about this in the past, you've said that this is just one of a number of measures, and there are lots of other factors to be taken into account when it comes to organ donation. For example, you have to be in a hospital which can remove organs, I think, within 20 minutes or so. I wonder if that's something that we would be equipped to do over here in the Isle of Man.
So in order to become an organ donor, you have to die in hospital, and you have to be ventilated. So that's really the clinch point, which means that thankfully, there aren't very many people that die in that circumstances. So it just means that every single donor is precious. There's only a few thousand in the whole of the UK that die in the right circumstances. We need every single donor so that we can save lives.
And speaking of how precious these lives are, the fact that this law has been called Max and Ciara's law really humanises this. Can you just tell us who Max and Ciara are?
I can, and I was at our annual conference last week, actually, where Max and Ciara's family spoke, and you've had a room of 1,000 transplant surgeons and donation professionals, and there wasn't a single dry eye in the house from start to finish. I'm tearing up just thinking about it. So Max is this force of nature, 11-year-old boy who received a heart transplant, and his mother spoke about and showed pictures of how just before he received his transplant she was told that he was as sick as he could possibly be, and if he hadn't received a transplant would have died very soon. And it's I have an 11-year-old myself, and it just you well up and you can't control it. And Ciara was his donor, so she died tragically in a car accident, and Max received her heart. And listening to Ciara's father and mother talking, and just the pride that they have, that it was tragic that she died, but she saved so many lives as a result.
And am I right in thinking as well that it was actually Max that campaigned for the law to be changed to include Ciara's name?
Yeah, the sense of love between the two families is incredible, and that's a bond that very few people manage to share. And when he was speaking at the conference last week, he was just saying how proud he was that this is Max and Ciara's law, and that he believes that he takes Ciara with him on all the adventures that he'll be having throughout the rest of his life.
That is just amazing, isn't it? Martin, then what's been the general reaction so far? I mean, you've been clear in saying that this is your mission to make sure this happens over here. How is it being received, would you say?
The consultation was very positive and there's a lot of support for it. And it's just a case of getting the mechanics of the law in place, making sure we come in line with England. So there's a seamless transfer of organs to the UK, to England. And publicity, I think, is the answer, because I think the Welsh experience told them that by upping the ante, making sure everybody spoke to their relatives, knowing their wishes, get them on the UK database. And one of the things that came out of the further discussions I've had is the Isle of Man is much better using the UK database. One point of contact, and it works best in both ways, because if a visiting biker has an accident in the Isle of Man, the doctors over here can immediately access the database. Is he a donor or is she a donor? And it becomes clear, and vice versa. If somebody from the Isle of Man has an accident in England, it just so streamlines things. Rather than make our own database and go to the expense of all that, we've very kindly been brought in on the back of the UK, which is fantastic.
And it is about sometimes, I suppose at the moment, Claire, just having difficult conversations with family members, and it's something that nobody really likes to think or talk about.
I agree completely, and nobody does like to think or talk about it, but we know that donor families it gives them a sense of pride, and it makes some sense out of something that is tragic and makes no sense at all. So what we would ask everybody to do is think about it. Do you want to be an organ donor? Do you want to help save people's lives after your death? If so, sign on to the organ donor register. It would take you 2-3 minutes, and tell your loved ones what you want to happen, because we know that at a time of tragedy and possible grief and distress, knowing what your loved one wanted helps those families at that time.
If somebody is on the organ donation list, perhaps they haven't necessarily had a conversation with their family, can the family members overrule that decision?
When we speak to the family members, we go explaining whether or not they sign on to the organ donor register, and we know that if people sign on to the organ donor register, it's very, very, very rare that the families will overrule that decision, and that's why the discussion between families is so important. But we do know that there are some situations where the families are just so distressed, it's just such a tragic situation that they may not be able to allow donation to go ahead, but the specialist nurses will always talk the family through them and support them wherever they can.
And I'm guessing they just want to know that their loved one is being looked after in the best possible way.
Exactly, and the care of the donor, the care of the family is of absolute paramount importance to us.
And Martin, if this is something that is adopted on the Isle of Man, how long are we looking at before it actually becomes something that is real over here?
I'm hoping that we can get the first reading of the bill, if all goes well. And of course, it's Brexit that's putting a bit of pressure on our our drafting legislators. I want to try and get the first reading in by the end of April, hopefully maybe March, but end of April certainly, and then progress it from there. And of course, it's obviously got to go through the Keys and the Legislative Council and then back to Tynwald. So with a bit of luck, hopefully this year after the recess, I would love to get our skates on and get this sorted out, because I think it's been dragging on for far too long.
And Claire, is there any idea of how many people actually die waiting for an organ donor?
So 3 people die every single day in need of a transplant. There just aren't enough to go around. There are 6,000 people on the transplant waiting list, but 3,000 people are suspended because they've just become too ill to survive the transplant process itself. So there's a desperate shortage, and I would really encourage everybody to think about whether or not you want to help save those people's lives.
And you are the head of the UK Blood Transfusion and Organ Transplant Service, and blood donor, again, is a very, very critical thing.
Exactly so. So it's not just the organs that are in terrible shortage, it's also blood, and can really help save and improve lives. So please don't just sign on to the organ donor register, sign yourself up as a blood donor as well.
And I mean, as ever with anything like this, knowledge is power. Where can people go to find comprehensive information about what's involved in organ donation?
So for organ donation, if you go to www.organdonation.nhs.uk, you can find out all the information there. That's where you can sign on to the organ donor register and find out also information about blood as well.